In the various and sundry systems that you might encounter, you'll probably also have different account types within those systems. We need to be aware of what those types are, specifically for our Security Plus exams. So let's start that conversation right now.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Welcome back to the Security Plus series here at IT Pro TV. Today's episode all about account types. You're thinking to yourself, what do you mean account types? There's accounts, there's people, they log in, this is their account, it's an account. It's easy, why are we doing a whole show? Well, unfortunately, there's a little more to it than just that. But the good news is Wes has decided to join us today to help us, well, wander through the mire that is account types. Wes, how's it going and where do we start?
All right, it's good. I was going to say, if it's an account type like my bank account, this will be a very, very short episode. But that's right. We've been talking, throughout this section, we've been talking about things like authorization, authentication, right? But we also have to talk a little bit about the account management aspect of it. And in order to properly manage accounts, you really have to know what kind of account types you have there. Now, I will tell you that in different systems, you have a great many different account types, right? But it really boils down to the most common ones that we're going to talk about, and we need to differentiate why you would implement. So again, remember the implementation. Where would I find these, and why would I use them? And that's going to be the really important key takeaway from here is not only identifying them, but seeing where exactly you would actually implement these different accounts.
All right, well, let's start with probably, well, the most revered, right? The most sought after account type, which would be administrator, right? That's what we all want to be. We want to have that title in front of our name and have that kind of control over the system, right?
Absolutely. And I'm thinking from a pen testing standpoint, he's like the most sought after, literally.
Yeah.
All right. And the administrator, right? So yeah, let's talk about the administrative accounts. Now, we're going to put this in two different contexts because I do want you to know that when we talk about administrators, depending on what operating system you are in, they traditionally have different designations, and you're going to see that coming up. But let's talk about, well, what are administrators? Well, we have to understand that administrators typically have full system access, unrestricted access. So really, they have the keys to the kingdom. And that's why it's important that with these type of accounts, we need to make sure that they're protected, right? Not only from our threat actors or our, well-groomed, hoodied people, we also have to protect them even from standard users, and that's important to understand too. And why do I say, it might be self-evident, if you will, why we would want threat actors, right? The attackers not to have administrative access. And why? Well, because if they can gain that, they can gain full system access, right? And that can be, that's a massive vulnerability, and it's certainly a massive risk to your networks and your company in general. So it's probably obvious why we would keep them, protected from threat actors. But what you might be asking yourself, why would we really worry about standard users? Well, there's a problem with that, right? Standard users don't need complete system access, and it's really about this concept that we've kind of mentioned here before, and I know Dan's mentioned it too, and that's the principle of least privilege, right? If a user doesn't need to perform some kind of action or privileged action, I should say, lock it down. That's important, right? So that's why I say we need to protect this from standard users, because with administrative access, they could have unintentional access or gain unintentional access to stuff that they shouldn't have access to, not only from the confidentiality side that we've talked about of the CIA triad, but also from the integrity standpoint too. When you've got things like databases, right? Especially with a database and maintaining a database integrity, you've got DBAs, database administrators, that is their sole function. Their job is to make sure that those databases maintain integrity. And if you give a standard user access to something like that, they might inadvertently delete an entire column within a database. And man, now we've got some really bad problems. And that's just a classic example of where standard users might have the best of intentions, but the outcomes probably aren't the ones that we want. Now, I did say that when we talk about in the context of administrators, they're called different things based on your operating system. Inside of Windows, we have what's called the Windows admin. Now, I will tell you, you can say that in Mac, you have kind of that administrative access, but you also have to remember that Mac in and of itself under the hood is essentially a Unix-based system. And when I say about that, I mean Unix, right? Unix, Linux, and even Mac, because Mac under the hood is really Berkeley Software Development. It's a BSD. And that's called the root user, right? That is the super user, if you will, of the overall entire system, and they have complete access. So If you're not aware of root user, maybe you've never been in a Linux environment, just remember the root user is what we would consider inside of a Windows operating system, the administrative user. So be aware of administrative users, and really that middle bullet point there, principal of least privilege, understand why we wouldn't just give standard users complete access to the system.
Yeah, unfortunately, I've seen that in the real world where I worked for a company when I first day there. I had a user on the phone trying to work through their problem. They're like, well, I'll just use this. I'm like, what's that? They're like, oh, it's the administrator account. I said, what administrator account? I don't know. It's administrator account. It was the domain admin.
Oh, that's great.
And apparently they gave it to everybody.
Oh, wow.
And everybody had access to it. I was like, this is not right.
Yeah.
This is wrong. We got to fix this.
I got a story about that too. When I first started out in IT, somebody accidentally made me the enterprise admin.
Oh.
And accidentally deleted all the other admins. So I was the only one that had access. That just goes to show you, when you start getting our age, do not configure your Active Directory without your glasses on. It can end up bad.
Yeah, it can end up bad. But there's a prime example of inadvertently causing issues.
Yeah.
And not only that, if I give that over to a standard user, then a hacker can maybe attack their account and then work his way up from there as well. I do that all the time.
That's a great point, and it just comes back to that unintentional, right? Best of intentions, but the outcomes are not what you want. And if you do that, your administrators typically, and should, for the most part, have the understanding that I have an administrative account. I use it sparingly. I do not just go in and start making modifications. Standard users, they might not have that experience. They might not understand why you don't write a password on a Post-it note, stick it on the top of their monitor, right? So it's definitely something that we need to be aware of, and as administrators, use those privileges and permissions sparingly, and definitely don't allocate those roles, right, those user types, to just anybody.
Yeah, and that kind of pushes us into the idea of the topic of those standard users, what they should be doing and how they should be used, because a lot of times even administrators run as standard users, and for good reason, because it's kind of got some controls to help keep things safe, right?
That's absolutely correct, Dan, and that's where it comes into standard users. Standard users, really, what they can do they can perform most activities. And when I say by most activities, is most of the day-to-day activities and the functionality they need. You only need a standard user. In fact, I can tell you, for the most part, we might be the exception here at IT Pro TV, because we're constantly modifying things and we're having to try out and test new things. So we do need administrative access. But outside of something like that, most people can get along day to day. Just, hey, I need to open a PowerPoint. I need to open an Excel spreadsheet. I need to open and configure a Word document. I need to check my email. You don't need administrative access to perform those functions, right? So they can perform most of their day-to-day activities, but what they can't do is make things like system-wide changes, right? And what I mean by a system-wide change is not just doing things like, for instance, changing the time clock, changing the time on the computer, but installing software. When you install a piece of software, that modifies, well, in Windows, it modifies the registry, but it modifies, even in Linux, they don't have the registry, but it modifies a lot of settings down there that they probably shouldn't have access to. So it's important to understand that standard users really don't need those elevated privileges to perform most of their day-to-day tasks.
And I'll just go ahead and throw this out there. A standard user will get themselves in trouble when they have elevated privileges. They'll turn off their antivirus. Oh, it makes my thing slow. They'll do all sorts of crazy stuff that you can't even fathom. And you're like, what made you think to do this? Well, it was stopping me from doing something I wanted. So I just whipped out the old admin stick and hit it with it.
That's
and
right.
I'm like, no, we got to fix that. So it is good that, again, even us as administrators work in user land, normal standard user type of accounts, so that we don't get ourselves in trouble, because it's easy to do. Make a mistake and then you're in the weeds.
And I like the point that you made, Dan, when we were talking about administrative access. Let's take, for instance, a standard user installing a piece of software or doing anything in the context of an administrator. Let's say they accidentally download a virus. Well, guess what? If they've got administrative level access, now that virus has access too. So again, this is one of the things that we want to talk about, and this is something I really want you to know. There is security versus convenience, all right? It is a balancing act, right? We want confidentiality and integrity, right? That is important. Authorized users no unauthorized modifications to information, but we also want availability. All right. And that's where the security versus convenience come in, right? Dan, you mentioned that a lot of people had administrative access. Well, if you get somebody that's in a support desk role, help desk role, and they're not doing due diligence, in their role, they say, you know what? I have had to take 100 calls for this application that we're supporting today. You know what? Next person that calls me, I'm going to make an administrator. Now I'm not getting calls anymore. That's right. Now you're getting calls from an auditing committee that works within your network or works within your company, wanting to know why we have data that's now exposed, let's say, out on the internet. So remember, this is going to come up more often than not. Principal of least privilege. If they do not need that privilege or permission to get their job done, do not assign it to them.
Yeah, good. Well, those are words of wisdom if I ever heard them in my life. Now let's move on to probably something that kind of gets relegated to the back of our mind. We don't think about it very often. It's the guest accounts.
Yeah.
Guest accounts. Well, I'll let you take it. Yeah. Here you go. You see the smile on my face.
Oh, yeah. Accounts. Oh, yeah. So guest accounts, these are very isolated use cases that I want you to be aware of. And a guest account is an account that has access to the computer, but doesn't have access to other locations within the computer, doesn't have access to user data, doesn't have access sometimes to even applications. So, like for instance, inside of a Windows environment, guest accounts only have access to what you give them access to. And by default, because they are such a security vulnerability, ever since XP went the way of the sundown or the dodo bird, when Vista came in, they said, you know what, we're going to just disable that account by default because it can become a point of attack, if you will. Right? For instance, examples of the use cases, things like kiosks. You might have a guest account that you're in a public location, right? And you have this one guest account that logs into all of the machines, or maybe on an individual basis. Remember, we want centralized administration. So a lot of times it'll be a single account used to log into multiple public kiosks, if you will. You might have computers that you share, right? It's supposed to say shared. Good English on my part. Shared computers, right? This might be something that you see in a classroom, right? You have a whole. I know that I worked for a tech company or a training company that they would set up, special customized classes for teachers and instructors that would come in, maybe not instructors right under our building, and they would have to have a certain configuration and setup. And rather than give them access to our Active Directory, we make a guest account, and that guest account would allow them at least enough access to perform whatever the function was that they were trying to perform. So they have very limited access, and one of the things I want you to remember, it is locked down. You want to remember, use these very sparingly, if at all.
All right, yeah, that's definitely right, because if I find a guest account, you never know what it has access to. A lot of people don't do their due diligence on really locking those things down, and work my way up the ladder and find myself in that admin position. That's what I like. All right, let's move on to service accounts. Great thing. I like service accounts because they're super helpful. Wes, explain to us what service accounts are and how they're used.
Sure. So when we get into service accounts, they are a necessity, all right? And what I mean by that is you might have, let's say, for instance, you're inside of a domain environment in Active Directory. You might have a web application that needs to access a server to grab a piece of data, right? That is a non-human, right? That's what we call, I think they call them NPEs, non-person identity. And what it needs is it needs to act and it needs to authenticate, if you will, just like a standard user. But there's nobody behind the wheel, right? I've heard that before, the engine's running, but there's nobody behind the wheel. But in this context, what that is the service account. So you want to be very careful in implementing these. You want to implement things like managed service accounts. And what I mean by that is in the earlier days, like for instance, in Active Directory, you would have to create a service account, and then you would have to sign its privileges and permissions, and then you would have to manage its password. And a lot of times it'll blur the line with another account that we'll talk about. It becomes a shared account. But the problem is you still have to do password management for it. A managed service account means that the system that you've created that service account on, again, if it's like a web application that needs access through an API to a specific, let's say, database on the back end, you want to make sure that it's a managed service account, not one that you just create like a regular user and you give it access to do what it does in the background and you set it and forget it, right? Managed service accounts mean that you have a platform that will give you the visibility and will help control the access levels that it has. one of the things that you can help, because you might have to use a service account, is remember to remove unnecessary privileges, right? So for instance, let me give you an example. I need this certain service, again, like I said, to access that database and pull something down and maybe deliver it on the front end on a web application to an end user. All right, well, that's good. That should be the only thing that it's allowed to do. There's no reason to make that service an administrator, right? That service account administrator, because maybe in the process of creating that account, something goes wrong and you're like, it's a permissions issue. Well, we could solve that. We'll just make it an administrator and now I don't have that problem anymore. So you want to make sure that you reduce, again, principal of least privilege always applies here, even with the service accounts that really don't have human, the human aspect driving them behind the scenes. Make sure that you remove any unnecessary privileges that it might have, principal of least privilege.
All right, let's talk about probably my most loathed of account types, which is the shared account, because you might as well just take your security, pull a gun, and shoot it right in the foot, because that's what you're doing when you're sharing accounts. Tell us a little more about this, would you?
Well, sure. When it comes to shared accounts are exactly that. You create one account, usually a single password that's on it, and we typically, write that down and we put it on the chalkboard or on the bulletin board right in the break room. I'm kidding, but the point is, it typically is going to be shared by multiple people, and let me tell you why that's a problem here. This little term, non-repudiation, right? Non-repudiation, and I know we've mentioned this, we really start talking about those three pillars, right? Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. But the fourth one here, there is a fourth one here, and it's kind of a cousin to the CIA triad, and that's non-repudiation. And what that means is that, if you remember from like IPsec, our IPsec shows, I want to make sure that any action that happens, right, can stay associated with the person or the entity, in this case a service account if we're talking about that, stays associated with the person that did it, all right? Well, if you have one shared account that I've seen before where 10 people use 10, 15, 20, 100 people use the same shared account, something happens to that shared account where maybe it runs contrary to, violates a security policy, which is really the technical definition of a security breach. Anything that violates a security policy, well, it wasn't me. I didn't do it, right? Who can you point that out to? So remember, security versus convenience, right? We don't want to have to manage more accounts than we have to, so we're just going to create one account and we'll let everybody share it. All right. Well, we made the CEO of the company this one special account. And that CEO says, well, I'll just go ahead and I'll share that with you. Well, first of all, the CEO might not need that level of privileges to begin with.
Sign your checks, boy.
That's right, exactly. And that's a great example of where somebody might come under pressure to do this. But you have to remember, if you are the person that's in the security role, you have to tell them, no, I do not. I have a job to do. You've hired me to be your security person. We need to keep these accounts secure. So do not use these security accounts or these shared accounts, because they can cause problems.
Yeah. Now, Wes, we got a few minutes left on the clock. If you wouldn't mind, maybe we take a little time and actually take a look at some of these accounts so we can get a little familiarized with them.
Sure, absolutely, Dan. Let's go ahead, and what we need to do, we'll log in as our administrator. Actually, I'm already logged in as the administrator, and then we're going to log in as a standard user, and we'll see the difference. In Windows, one of the ways that you can tell that you have to be an administrator to do or perform any function is by this little shield. It's the same thing down in the control panel. You'll see little functions that you might want to perform, and they got that little shield. And what that lets us know is that the user account control is going to kick in, and you're going to see that when I double click on this. And the user account control is Microsoft's implementation of the principle of least privilege. It just says, hey, if you're an administrator, yeah, I'll let you go ahead and install this, but I'm going to protect you to just make sure that it isn't malicious software running that installer. And I'm not going to actually go through the installation process. I've already got Wireshark installed on this, and I'm going to just go ahead and say no, and we'll just go ahead and cancel out of that. And we'll go ahead and, Dan, what do you say? Well, I'll log out as our administrative user and maybe log in as the second account that's a standard user. So we'll go ahead and we'll sign out here. And again, so Student01 is an administrative account. I've also got another account that I created here that is in just a normal user's location versus the administrative group that really is what gives Student01 their administrative abilities. So let's go ahead and we'll log in as Student02 here. And once we get to the desktop, you'll see I have that same executable, little Wireshark executable for, to install a packet sniffer here. It's right on the desktop. It looks no different. So to me, if I'm a standard user, I really don't see what the difference is here until I go to click on this. And when I go to click on this, notice what happens. It doesn't just give me the yes or no, right? It tells me, well, you're not an administrator. If you're going to do this, you need to log in as an administrative account. And that's kind of something that Linux and Unix systems have been doing for a very long time. You log in normally, if you don't log in as a root, and you shouldn't do that. You log in as a standard user, and if you need to elevate your privileges, you elevate them from there. So notice that if I choose yes, it's going to say, no, you can't do this because you are not, you're not acting or operating in the context of the administrative user. And that's one of the ways you can see. I can't install applications. It makes a system-wide change, modifies the registry. And if I don't need to perform that as part of my job function, then I shouldn't have that level of privilege. And that's one of the things you need to understand when you look at the different types of accounts and, really just any entry into basic account management.
Awesome. It's a really nice and simple way to see the difference between those administrative accounts versus those standard user accounts. We don't want those standard users making those changes, so you would need to authenticate in some way as an administrator if you needed to be able to do that. If you don't have those creds, well, guess what? You're getting nothing, just as it should be. That being said, Wes, it looks like we've come to the end of yet another really great episode. Thank you so much for your time. Sure. And thank you for joining us. There is more to come, though, in our Security Plus. That's the name of this course. In Security Plus. So hopefully we'll see you there. Until then, have yourself a great day.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.